Hello, and welcome to the Datsusara podcast, where we talk with my favorite people about how to escape suffering and find your true path. I'm your host, Chris Odell. All right, so today I'm extremely excited because we've got a guy who's kind of a big deal these days on the podcast. He is Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, a public speaker, creator of the self-authoring course, and the guy's just been super busy lately doing a lot of things. I'm fairly sure that a lot of you will have heard of him, also through his appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. I highly recommend you check those out. And just go on YouTube, you see a million clips, and that's kind of how I got introduced into Peterson. It was just a few different topics that I had that I was interested in politically and spiritually and mythologically, let's say. And I ran into his work, and I thought, okay, this guy's really interesting. And I just kept digging in, and I found more and more really interesting things that he talks about, and I find. The guy knows a lot about mythology, and he looks at it from a psychological perspective, which I find particularly interesting. And I also have found that he's very much a pragmatist as well. So the information that he conveys and the way that he shows you things is intended to help, I think, people find more meaning in life and find a way to figure out what is the best action they can possibly take to make the world better for themselves, their families, and everybody else. And it's really hard to sum it all up, but I think this conversation went pretty good because he touched on a lot of different things that he talks about. But I will apologize because this probably is going to come off as somewhat of my personal therapy session mixed with the usual podcast. I actually didn't know until right before we started if I was going to be able to be recording a podcast or if this was just a personal conversation, because that's all we really had scheduled was just a phone call. Anyway, so it should be interesting, but I've just got to urge anybody, if you find this talk interesting in the slightest, I do go check out the rest of Peterson's work. For me, it's helped me put together a lot of pieces from different philosophies and just general ways of thinking that I wasn't able to piece together in a functional. Pragmatic way in the past. And I think it's been a great relief to me, a great source of inspiration. And I just think Peterson's doing some great work. So without further ado from me, I'm just going to let the man speak for himself. So here we go with Jordan Peterson.
What would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life?
Welcome to the Datsusara podcast.
If you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing.
Well, I'll just jump right into it because I know your time's limited here, and I thank you for doing this and all the work you've been doing lately. You've been very busy.
Yes, that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
I'm probably too publicly exposed, really, but we'll see. We'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I'll be coming to your talk.
It's been a real privilege,
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that, but I'm afraid people are going to get sick of me because I seem to be everywhere at the moment online and so on. So there's some danger in that.
Could be. I imagined there must be a little bit of a balance in your, your work life kind of setup there that could be a little bit tricky too.
Yeah, well, it's hard when it's difficult to manage the proper balance when you're dealing with a new technology like YouTube that's so incredibly powerful, and it's a strange thing to be able to deliver academic information and say philosophical information to millions of people. It's not something that we have any rules about how to contend with,
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of flying by the seat of my pants, so to speak, and hoping that I'm getting the balance right.
Well, it seems like you're doing a pretty good job from the public end over here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, lucky me.
Yeah. So let me jump into one question I love to ask people. What advice would you have for a person that say it seems to be somewhat miserable and suffering in their current life path, career-wise or other, but doesn't know what they want to do?
Well, I hate to push a product on you, but we've designed something that's exactly aimed at that problem, and for exactly that reason. I don't know if you know about it, but I have a program on a website called selfauthoring.com, and there are 3 writing exercises there. One helps people write an autobiography, and so it asks you to divide your life into 6 epochs and then to identify the events of major significance, both positive and negative, that have shaped you, and to try to analyze them so that you can develop a causal model of the negative events so that you can avoid them in the future. And it's a way of doing 2 things, and one is putting your past to rest. So there's sort of a rule of thumb. If you have a memory that's older than about 18 months that still produces negative emotion when the memory is elicited, that means that there's still information in that sequence of experiences that you haven't completely mined for significance, right? Your brain is still reacting to those experiences as if they're active threats. And so you have to do a causal analysis to figure out exactly what it was that led to that vulnerability so that you can avoid similar situations in the future. And that will help your nervous system calm down and return to something approximating homeostasis. Because the purpose of memory isn't to remember the past, you see. The purpose of memory is so that you can duplicate the good things that happened in the past again in the future and also avoid the negative things. It's a very practical ability, and it's designed to help orient you in life. So the past authoring program can help you clarify your past, let's say, and remove some of the excess baggage and weight, but also let you know where you are and perhaps why. And then there's a present authoring program that helps you identify your faults and your virtues so that you can rectify the former and capitalize on the latter. And then, perhaps most importantly, there's a future authoring program. And this is something I believe that everyone should be doing early in their life. This doesn't happen in school, although we're building a high school version right now. What the future authoring program asks you to do is to imagine that you're charged with your own care. Imagine that you're caring for yourself as if you are caring for someone that you care about and love and want the best for, which you have to put yourself in that mindset. And that's not easy, because it isn't easy for people to treat themselves that way, because people are very cognizant of their own failings and insufficiencies, and they're self-conscious and self-critical. And so people are often harder on themselves than they are on anyone else. And so you have to sort of suspend that and say, well, look, if I was trying to design a life that would be good for this person, not necessarily giving them everything they impulsively want, but that would be good for them over the long run, what would that look like? And then the program asked you to consider, well, what you would want from your friendships and from your family and from your intimate relationships and from your career and from your educational, how you would educate yourself and develop your skills across time, and how you would take care of yourself mentally and physically. What that would look like if you could have it the way that it should be for you. Just so you have a goal, a positive goal, and then you're asked to write for 15 minutes about what your life could be like in 3 to 5 years if things could turn out for you the way that you wanted them to. And then you're asked to do the opposite, which is to imagine all the weaknesses and faults that you're prey to at the moment, and imagine that they get the upper hand and sort of auger you into the ground. And that gives you a heaven to look forward to, so to speak, and a hell to avoid, and that can help maximize motivation. And then you're asked to make a detailed plan about that, so that you can take your positive vision and turn it into something that's implementable, and you're asked to thoroughly justify it, to think it through, and to set up the arguments for it. And you're also encouraged to do it badly, because it's easy for people to get perfectionistic and think that they have to, do it 100% right when they're sketching out their future. But you don't have to. You just have to at least start to develop a vision and to see yourself as someone who can take control of your life and make plans and move forward in a conscious and programmatic manner. And that program has has had very positive effects, for example, on keeping university students in university and also increasing their grade point averages. And so I would say that would be my advice. We've spent a lot of time working on that program, and it seems to work really well for people. And it helps break down the problem of what you should do with your life into sort of manageable and comprehensible sub-problems. And you need that, because it's just too big a problem to tackle all at once.
Yeah, I completed all the suites myself, found them very useful. I wish I would have ran into the past authoring one many years ago when I had kind of a generalized anxiety disorder. Would have been super useful back then, but still, it was a really, really good tool.
Good. So what did it do for you?
I think for me, at least with the past authoring, it helped settle a lot of things that were still bothering me, things that did after many, many years. Some of them were 20 years older or more, even childhood things that I was still holding on to that I never broke them down and understood them beyond, that was a negative thing. I never kind of looked at it and came to terms with it, realized what I could have done, or what was learned out of that. Yeah, I think it helped me be more comfortable with a lot of that.
The thing is, it's funny that you can get stuck in the past like that, because if something happens that you don't understand, then it's, what your body essentially does, your mind as well, but it's a mind-body unity. What it essentially does is mark at any time that something negative happens to you, it basically marks that area of interaction as unexplored and dangerous territory, right? And then you may never revisit it. And so it's as if you have this map in your head where large swaths of it, dating from God only knows how long ago, are marked off as, there be dragons here. It's too dangerous to traverse. And the thing is, many of those dangers are no longer relevant because, of course, the things that threatened you when you were, say, 6 years old or 13 years old or even 20 years old are not things that would threaten you now. The danger just doesn't exist. You're not the same person, and you have a different set of tools and so forth. But that doesn't mean that that gets updated, because it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so then the more of the territory that you've walked through in your life that's marked off as dangerous and threatening, the higher your level of chronic stress, because your body is always trying to calibrate how prepared for emergency it should be at every moment. And if there's a lot of your past experience that's marked off as dangerous, then your body assumes that you're in hostile territory, and it always keeps you on edge and anxious. So that's very bad for you. It the cortisol production that's a consequence of that basically makes you old.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Yep. It was definitely a great thing to go back. I noticed some recurring themes too, in my past at least, which I might get to with a later question. But before I jump too far off there, I found that even for myself, I'm working in a job. I have my own company, a hemp gear company. We make bags and apparel and stuff like that. And I feel like I'm pretty well aligned with my values and what I want to do with my time. But even then, I still find like I struggled with the future authoring course a little bit because I'm comfortable enough, but I still have a hard time, let's say, having motivation on sometimes to just get up and get to it. And there's always so many parts of the job that I don't want to deal with. And I wonder sometimes if that's maybe indicative of a problem with how I'm going at it, or how maybe I'm not really aligned with what I want, or perhaps that's just something that we have to just deal with, and that even in the best of situations, you're still going to have days where you just don't want to get out of bed and get to it.
Well, some of that, there's a variety of potential reasons for that. Some of it is just normal variability in mood. So some of it might be that you experience higher than average levels of negative emotion, and so that, a complex situation can be tagged as an opportunity or as a threat, and the positive emotion system tags it as an opportunity, and the negative emotion system tags it as a threat, and there's always a war between those two. And some days a complicated challenge is something that gets you out of bed because you're excited to tackle it, and other days you think, oh my God, that's just too much. I'm not sure I'll be able to manage it. And I would say if you have your goals in order and you're still suffering from an excess of withdrawal related negative emotion, that there are things that are that conceivably can be done about that. The simple things I would recommend is that you stabilize what time you wake up in the morning. That makes a big difference. If your nervous system tilts towards negative emotion, then regularizing your sleep-wake cycle can help, because unstable circadian rhythms can increase emotional volatility. I would also recommend that you routinize your morning so that you do the same thing every time you wake up, and especially to eat a large breakfast. Because if you have a nervous system that is prone to excess levels of negative emotion, then it's really easy to stress yourself in the morning. And if you haven't eaten, then what happens is you overproduce insulin, and that tends to take the blood sugar out of your blood, obviously. And it's very difficult to regulate yourself again after that during the day. So until you sleep again. So I've had lots of clients, because I am a clinical psychologist, I've had lots of clients who learned to eat a large breakfast, a fat and protein heavy breakfast, I would say, not a carbohydrate laden breakfast, who've had remarkable decreases in the amount of anxiety they experience just as a consequence of doing that.
Good advice.
The other thing you can do is, if you have negative things that you have to face, is to figure out how to bargain with yourself to get you to do them. So you might imagine that you're bargaining with someone else, and you're trying to get them to do something that's difficult and challenging and threatening. And, you need to build rewards into it. And you might say, well, okay, I have this paperwork I have to attend to today, and it's going to be onerous and nerve-wracking. So maybe all I'm going to do today is open it and take a look at it for 10 minutes. And if I do that, then I'm going to go and have a coffee and relax, or I'm going to do something that I like to do as a reward. And you kind of have to learn to negotiate with yourself, I think, in order to bring yourself through those more difficult jobs, like you would negotiate with someone who isn't you, because you can't really command yourself. And people think that's possible. You're not really your own slave. And it's much better to negotiate, I would say, because you can sit on the edge of your bed in the morning and think about the things you have to do that you don't want to do. And you can ask yourself, like you'd ask another person, okay, under what circumstances would I be willing to tackle this? How would I have to organize my day so that I would, in fact, begin this? And you have to be, I guess, in some sense, accepting of your own fallibility to do that, because it's easy to say, well, I should just hitch up my trousers and get the hell to work, and whack yourself on the back of the head with a stick. And you can get somewhere with that, but it's kind of tyrannical. It's better to say, okay, well, inertia in the face of difficulty and fear in the face of complexity and threat are natural reactions, and there has to be something to counterbalance that. And what is it? Like, okay, you have to do this difficult thing. All right, what payment do you need so that you would do it willingly and voluntarily? And I think that's very useful. It's useful to learn to treat yourself that way too, because then you're starting to treat yourself with a bit of, I would say, understanding and kindness, as well as discipline, because of course you're still doing the tasks, you still have the responsibilities. But learning to negotiate with yourself is as if you're a person you don't understand. That's the critical thing, because people think that they're sort of transparent to themselves. But we have a nature, as you know, you try to make decisions and stick to them, and you think the decisions are good, and then you find yourself rebelling. And what that teaches you is that you aren't your own being in some sense. You're a being that has a nature, and you can control that nature to some degree, but mostly it's better to negotiate with it. So that's another thing I would recommend.
Very good advice. So switching gears a little bit, your work seems to have a focus on helping individuals manifest the best versions of themselves, let's say. And I think you've suggested in this way that'll also help maybe solve or alleviate some of the greater suffering in the world. I have friends that suggest the same and often think I should avoid public critiquing of political and other issues. But I personally have had this problem where I feel very compelled to call bullshit on things when I see it. I see you doing this as well. I mean, you're out there getting involved in the public debate, and I'm wondering, what is it that you see to be gained out of that? And, what are the pitfalls there? And why do you keep doing it? I'm curious.
Well, I did it. That's a very good question. I mean, I had personal reasons for doing it in Canada, and that was because there was legislation afoot that mandated a certain kind of speech, and I felt that was a sufficient intrusion of the political into the personal to warrant some objection. There was a bill that was put forward in Canada that made it mandatory, essentially, to use what have come to be known as preferred pronouns for people who have non-standard gender identities. And I don't particularly have a problem with people who have non-standard gendered identities. As far as I'm concerned, that's their business. But when they're using the force of the law to impose a requirement for my use of language in accordance with their hypothesis about their identity and about the nature of human identity in general, then I believe, A, that's gone too far, and B, that the purpose of that isn't the stated purpose. I believe the actual purpose is the extension of the control of a certain kind of political ideology over the political system and the personal domain. And it's an ideology, which is the postmodern neo-Marxist ideology, that I regard as abhorrent. And so I'm not willing to use their language. And that was that. So for me, that's where the political met the personal. And I felt that warranted at least an observation on my part that I wasn't okay with that. I didn't really expect the consequences of doing so to be as dramatic as they have been, but I think the reason that they're as dramatic as they have been is because I was correct in my diagnosis in that this particular ideology, which absolutely dominates the universities, which is something else that I have a major problem with, has vastly overextended its reach. And I think that that's destabilizing our society in a serious way. And so normally, if the political system is working, I think you can ignore it. That might even be a sign that it's working, that it's okay to ignore it and pay attention to your personal life.
Yeah.
But I felt that that we're not in those times exactly, and I think that subsequent events have borne that out. So.
And you think it helps to call these things out and encourage that public debate?
Well, I guess we're going to find out. The alternative seems to be something like capitulation,
Yeah.
and I think that that's inappropriate. So,
right.
I don't know if there's any way of knowing if it's going to be helpful. I think it's helpful. I mean, what I've been seeing happening over the last year is that an increasing number of academics have come out of the woodwork to stand in opposition to the dominance of this particular kind of ideology on university campuses. So I noticed, for example, that Jonathan Haidt and Camille Paglia and Brett Weinstein and a variety of other people are doing an extensive set of campus tours this fall to speak about the issue of free speech. And, I can't help but think that that's a good thing. So I think we're too much in the middle of things right now to know how much good that's going to do, because I suppose you could make the case that it will just fuel excess polarization, which seems to be happening, for example, at places like Berkeley. But I don't see what the alternative is, because we're definitely in a war of complex ideas, and they have to be discussed because they have real world consequences. I mean, a good example is what happened in the United States with Title IX, which was originally nothing but legislation to ensure that women's sports teams and men's sports teams were funded at roughly equivalent levels in universities, which you could argue for or against, but seems like a relatively harmless piece of legislation. And it ended up transforming the universities into quasi-judicial inquisitions regarding every aspect of the sexual lives of university students, which I believe is, it's so appalling to me. It's almost unspeakable that the government I mean, I read the original memo that was set out to universities telling them that they had to set out these quasi-judicial boards of inquiry, and they basically set up a parallel court system with none of the safeguards that the normal court system has to investigate the private lives of university students. And, that's a very, very bad precedent to set up these quasi-judicial institutions outside the legal system. Mm-hmm. It's on the basis of an anti-patriarchal ideology, which I think is flawed both psychiatrically and logically right from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. So it needs to be pushed back, and hopefully that's what's starting to happen. We'll see.
Seems to be.
It seems to be.
In relation to that, I find that, well, you said something to the effect of that never say anything that makes you feel weak. And I find that generally when I argue about some of these things online, if I'm more well-informed, I don't feel as much anxiety or weakness, but sometimes despite being extremely well-informed on an issue, when I get into these debates, even with fairly reasonable people, I've noticed my own anxiety levels go up. Sometimes my health even suffers when I just get too involved in all of that. And I wonder if that's just an issue of my own personal bravery. I also noticed with me personally in my past authoring, that was a recurring theme. I had a lot of issues where I had either public speaking or other debates with people that led to severe embarrassment and just, real, definitely emotional distress. But again, I can't seem to help myself but to speak up and say something. And I'm wondering, is there some, do you ever struggle with those things? You've seen people that struggle with that?
all the time. I've been terrified out of my skull ever since last September.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Because I've been in a situation where it's always seemed to me that one false verbal move and I was dead in the water, so.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't think bravery has anything to do with not being afraid. Mm. It has to do with trying to do the right thing regardless of whether you're afraid. And when I say that you shouldn't say things that make you weak, I don't mean that saying things, you should never say anything that makes you afraid. I think those things are different. It's the feeling that I'm talking about more is when you're, like if you look at YouTube comments, for example, you often see people engaging in what would you call reciprocal insults, and they're trying to score points off each other or dominate or that sort of thing. And I believe that those sorts of interactions make you ethically weak. What you're supposed to be doing is to put forward what you regard as the truth as carefully as you possibly can and accept the consequences of that. And I think that you can feel that as an internal certainty about the correctness of your words. That's what you're trying to feel out. Is like, have you got the word exactly right? Have you got the phrase exactly right? Are you putting forward your statements to clarify the situation and to move towards the truth? Or are you trying to straw man your opponent and score points to bolster your ego, which is not helpful, especially not in an important debate? And then I guess the other thing I would say is, well, don't sacrifice your well-being any more than necessary when you're engaging in these sorts of arguments, because at least in principle you want to be around to argue and to debate for a long period of time. And that's advice I should take myself, and I'm trying to do that to regulate my interaction with the broader political landscape, so that it doesn't take too much out of me, because it's very, public speaking is one of people's number one fears, right? Because you're putting yourself open, especially if you're speaking honestly, you're opening yourself up to immense public criticism, and that can be very salutary. It can teach you a lot, but it's also no trivial manner to expose yourself to the judgment of the group, because you have to get along with the group, and it can certainly tear you apart. And plenty of that has been happening to people over the last few years, especially with the rise of social media. Mm-hmm. So you have every reason to be nervous, and so I would say, well, don't push yourself past your physiological capacity for too long a period of time, because it's wearing, and you're more likely, the other thing is you're more likely to make a mistake, eh? Mm-hmm. So, but the fact that it stresses you, well, I don't think that that's anything above and beyond the ordinary. I mean, you already indicated that perhaps you feel more negative emotion than the typical person might, and that can easily be a temperamental thing. I mean, that sounds like higher than normal levels of the big five trait that's termed neuroticism, which is sensitivity to threat and punishment. And, people are wired a particular way from very early on. And you can modify that to some degree, but it's usually a temperamental feature that you have to take into account. So you pace yourself.
I think one thing that would help would be learning to articulate oneself better, such as even simple things like I've noticed I grew up in a culture where we use the term like all the time. You put that in, and it drives me absolutely crazy hearing it come from my mouth, but it's been very difficult to get rid of that. And I'm wondering if you could have any advice on how someone could learn to just articulate themselves better and, speak well, properly, as it were.
Well, I think part of it is writing. If you have questions that you want to address and you need the answers to them, that's what writing is for, because that helps you get your arguments in order. And when you write things, and I don't mean copying them from what other people have said, I mean reading and then writing down your own conclusions in your own words, that's really produces, I would say, new neural pathways, new elements of your character. And so that can help strengthen your arguments to a great degree. And then watching what you're saying and feeling the words and searching to get the phrase precise and accurate with intense attention and care is also something that you can practice doing. And that's associated with what we were talking about earlier, with that feeling of either strength or weakness that's associated with your words. And I think that there's no end to how much you can practice that and how good you can get at it. But the important thing is that you have to decide what you're doing in a really deep level, and one thing you might be doing is winning arguments, and another thing you might be doing is trying to articulate your truth. And I would say that the second is far superior to the first, because articulating your truth is exactly what helps you to delineate what landscape you live in and how you're going to walk through it properly. And you have to make a vow in some sense, I would say, or a decision. It's like a Kierkegaardian decision of faith that you're going to allow your relationship with the truth to guide you through life. And that's one of the things that helps you pick your words much more carefully and become much more articulate. It also stops you from second guessing, because if you're always strategizing about how you're going to attain victory, then you have to bend your words to that particular victory. But if all you're trying to do is to say what you think as clearly as possible and let the cards fall where they're going to, then that removes a level of complexity. I mean, it exposes you to a certain risk, which is whatever the risk is of actually letting people know what you think. And it's not like that's not a risk. But there's a risk on the other side, which is that you falsify yourself and that you don't even know what you think, and that you start creating a false personality and a false world, and you would live in that. So there's no risk-free alternative.
Right.
But I would say, and it's a dictum, let's say, of Judeo-Christian culture, of Western culture, that the best guide to life is the truth. And it's certainly possible to debate that, because people say, well, there's all sorts of fakers and liars and corrupt people who seem to do just fine, which, by the way, is something I don't agree with at all. In my clinical practice, I've never, ever seen that be true even once.
Interesting.
Every person I've ever seen is punished for every single sin they ever commit. That's how it looks to me. And I think it's because if you warp the nature of reality, like, you can bend it to some degree, but when it snaps back, it'll knock you flat. And you might not even be able to make the causal connection between your error and the punishment that you're undergoing. But if you do a careful analysis, the causal connection becomes very clear. If you're the sort of person who betrays people, you end up friendless and alone. And what are you going to do with your ill-gotten gains under those sorts of circumstances? You're going to spend it on trivial, impulsive pleasures that are just ashes in your mouth. There's nothing about that that's good. And so I think that people who are cynical about the utility of truth in terms of moving you forward properly through life have very little understanding of, let's call it, the wages of sin. Because leading a corrupt life puts you in a situation that is absolutely unenviable by any measure. So
it's good. Yeah, agreed. And I want to be conscious of your time, but also if there's any chance of extending it, I'm happy to donate more or whatnot. If you have a few more minutes, I have about 3 or 4 more questions, and I don't want to push your schedule.
Let's answer your questions.
Thank you, Jordan. So you've demonstrated some of the problems with utopia promoting idealists, and I might have suffered that complex myself, not thinking it over very well in the past. So what do you think the best way is to seek change in the world to help alleviate suffering? Because if we all reach that great potential for good, wouldn't that eventually lead to some sort of utopia?
Well, I really do think that you act locally. Mm-hmm. You try to look at the beam or the mote in your own eye, or the beam in your own eye, not the mote in your brother's eye. And there's plenty of things that you're doing wrong that you could do better, that you would actually do better if you tried. And I think that the proper approach, the approach that's infused with the kind of humility that makes learning possible, is to look at what's immediately around you and set that in order. And that's your life to begin with, and your family's life, and then maybe your community's life to the degree that you can extend yourself outward, and to go forward cautiously as you learn to extend your capacity to do good, and not assume that you have the systemic answers to begin with, because you don't. The system we live in is so complicated that no one understands it. And it actually works pretty well. In fact, I'm the sort of person who's always in a state of amazement whenever I go anywhere when things work. The streetlights work, the power works, the streetcars work, the highways work, the power grid works, the electronic communications work. It's like, and there are people out there who are just breaking themselves in half under very trying circumstances constantly to keep all these insanely complicated systems up and running. Mm-hmm. And they actually do. And to think that you can make large-scale suggestions about how those systems could be transformed for the better is an indication of only 2 things. One is that you're possessed by a kind of ideological arrogance that's almost satanic, and the second is that you're just absolutely ignorant of the complexity of the systems. Like, I went and visited the Tesla factory a while back, and it's about a mile square, so it's a huge building, and I don't know how many moving parts there are in that building. Like, maybe there's 20 million. And every single one of those 20 million parts is actually working. It's just, and that's just a tiny microcosm of Silicon Valley, which is a tiny microcosm of this massive industrial enterprise. And, the fact that it works and that thing emits automobiles that have this miraculous capacity to function for years and to work electrically, it's so unlikely that any of that exists, that we should be wandering around in a cloud of like unmitigated gratitude that like our natural gas systems aren't constantly exploding and our plumbing falling apart and like masked bandits breaking into our house. And it's because that's normality, man. That's the way life is. Life, like everything, tends towards chaos and destruction of its own accord. And the fact that isn't constantly happening, I guess that's my essential Hobbesian view of mankind in the world. It's like chaos and destruction is the norm. And whenever that isn't happening to you right now, you are in such a favorable position that you should be down on your knees in gratitude. Mm-hmm. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
And so then I would say, well, be grateful for what you have. Try to understand how unlikely that is and how historically rare it is that that's the case. And then look around and see if there's something you can do that's positive, even on a small scale, to maybe make things a little better instead of worse. Mm-hmm. So
that's good. Yeah, I definitely, even just going through your works and listening to your talks and things, I've I've certainly come to a new perspective on just being grateful for the things around me versus always just looking for the little flaws. I mean, there's so many things that I did not appreciate at all, or as much as I could have in my life, because I was too busy worrying about, the 1 or 2% that wasn't quite right and therefore seemed like some terrible injustice. And wasn't doing me any good.
I mean, it's certainly the case that there are injustices plague our systems, but that doesn't mean that we know easily what to do about it. And it also doesn't mean that there's any malevolent force at work producing that. I mean, I'm not saying there's no corruption,
sure.
but one question is, well, corruption compared to what?
Right. To
your hypothetical utopia, or to like every other country that's ever existed in the entire span of mankind's history, which is a much better comparison. I'm reading one of Robert Conquest's books on the early stages of the Soviet Revolution, and the things that happened in places like the Ukraine were so terrible that you just, there's no words for it. And it happened for decades and decades. And the fact that we're not in a situation like that should paralyze everyone with gratitude. But people don't know the history. And so they just have no idea. They either have no idea how terrible things can be and how easily they can be terrible, or their spirits have become so darkened by resentment and jealousy that they feel that having things break down would be fine as long as everyone was suffering equally, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, definitely not. In relation to that, one of the things that I've thought a lot about is in regards to the environment and morality. I've been kind of I guess I could call myself an environmentalist, but I'm now critiquing myself on that a little bit. But it came from the fact that I find it much more simple in some ways to be a moral, decent person with dealing with people or basic actions like taking care of children, animals, that sort of thing. But it's very difficult for me to feel morally correct when I'm, say, buying something maybe that I don't really need, or eating food that I know was raised in a factory farm or whatnot, and it just seems unnecessarily cruel and wasteful. But without being, in modern society, without being a monk in the woods, I just don't see a realistic way around doing a lot of things that I know are terrible in that manner. Without becoming a total environmental maniac about it. And I see that you've spoken out in support of environmental cleanup of the ocean, for instance, but you haven't spoken much about other environmental issues, and you seem to take a little bit of exception.
I've spoken about the ocean because I worked for a UN Committee on Sustainable Development, the Secretary General's Committee on Sustainable Development, for about 3 years, and had a chance to study environmental and economic policies in great detail. And my fundamental conclusion was that the thing that we're doing that's the most food, where we absolutely decimating the oceans. And it's not something that's really on anyone's radar, but we are absolutely decimating the oceans. And it's kind of invisible, and it's really unfortunate because the oceans have a tremendous capacity for self-renewal, and if we just left them the hell alone for a while, they'd recover. And so, having reviewed many books and across the whole spectrum, from, say, reformed environmentalists like Bjorn Lundgren, I think that's his name, in Scandinavia, who's a very interesting person, to the more radical environmentalist types who think that we're destroying the planet, in an irreparable manner. I concluded that, well, the most fundamental threat at the moment is a threat to the integrity of the oceans. And so I have made a video about that and have talked about it to some degree, although it isn't one of those topics that seems to have any political weight, But then, back to your more fundamental point is, well, there's a certain amount of existential guilt in existence, life feeds on life, and to be alive is to partake in the tragedy of life and also to be subject to it, So I guess that's part of what makes it fair. And you might say, well, you want to do the least amount of damage and the most good that you can, but that doesn't mean you won't do any damage, because just by existing, you have to eat. And by eating, you're taking food away from, at minimum, you're taking food away from other things that could eat, and at maximum, you're you're participating in the bloody carnage that makes up life itself. But, I don't see exactly, apart from trying to minimize that and apart from trying to live a good life, I don't see how you can reduce that past some absolute level. And I don't feel that berating yourself for the evil of your being is helpful in that regard. And partly I believe that because what I've seen is that, you can make a case, and I've written about that a lot in my new book, which is coming out in January.
I mean,
you can make a case that being is so brutal that it should never have existed. In Goethe's Faust, that's the claim that Mephistopheles makes, right? So Mephistopheles is the satanic figure that Faust makes the deal with the devil with. And Mephistopheles is always working to destroy being, and his argument is an argument that's sort of similar to the one you made about your own guilt, which is the conditions of life are so brutal, the conditions of existence are so intrinsically brutal that it would be better if nothing at all existed. And, that's a non-trivial argument, and many people have been tempted to adopt that. Tolstoy himself was tempted by that argument. It's an argument that's made for the non-existence of God in The Brothers Karamazov by Ivan, who's Dostoevsky's sort of foremost atheist, powerful atheist. But the problem with that is that if you adopt that perspective, that being is so horrible and so brutal that it should have never come about, then you start to act in that manner. You start to act as a destructive being, and then everything gets worse instead of better. And so it seems to me that you have to adopt the perspective that despite its brutality and tragedy, that there are modes of being that are acceptable, and that your duty as a conscious and moral human being is to find a pathway of that improves things rather than makes them worse, and that's in total something like that you have to justify the rapacity of your being by the good that you do, something like that. Yeah. And so, for example, it might not be how much money you have that's relevant. It might be what you do with the money that you have. And there's a difference, for example, between spending your money on impulsive pleasures that are destructive to you and others in the medium to the long term, and investing in tools and let's say tools, leave it at that for now, that enable your actions in the world to expand so that you can inform people and educate people and help the world stay on the proper line between chaos and order. And I think that's what you do to justify the outrage of your being. It's something like that. And I think that's an existential idea, is that it's sort of associated with the idea of original sin, that there's something integrally wrong with human beings and that we have to pay for. And everyone feels that to some degree, that we have to bear a responsibility for just because of what we are, not even because of what we've done. And I think that's the call to morality, and it's deeply embedded inside of people. And if they don't adhere to its call, then they suffer psychologically for it. Yeah. So I guess there's an ethic built into being that helps counterbalance the horror of being. That's what it looks like to me.
Well, it does seem to certainly help, and I appreciate everything you've been doing with all your talks. It really has helped me find a better way in life, and I think a lot of people.
Well, I'm absolutely grateful for that's been the effect. I mean, it's thank God for that. That's all I can say.
It's impressive. I think what you've done, the way, I don't know, I found a more pragmatic approach. I've studied a lot of different religions, philosophy, other things, and while I understand them, they all sound good, and I put some of those things into my, life. The things that you teach are somehow more actionable or like I say, a pragmatic, where it's all of a sudden I went, oh, okay, now it really sunk in, and I thought, okay, well, here's a way I can actually put this forward and live this in a way that I I haven't ran into someone who's put it all together that way before.
Well, one of the things that Carl Jung said that's very, very helpful was that the idea of the incarnation, say, is equivalent to the idea that the archetype has to be realized in an individual life. So you can think, for example, symbolically, that Christ is the ideal man. This is completely independent of the metaphysical existence of Christ. That isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the collective imagination of the West trying to formulate a picture of what the ideal man would be. Mm-hmm. And then, so there's the ideal, but then there's the incarnation of that ideal in a particular time and place. So the ideal has to be an abstract, right? It has to be abstract because it has to be applicable to everyone. And as the ideal becomes abstract, it loses the kind of detail that enables you to connect with it. And so the goal is to nail the archetype to the ground in a particular time and place. And that's why there's this idea in Christianity that Christ is the logos that exists eternally, which is the conscious, attentive, communicative force that generates order out of chaos and sometimes transforms order into chaos when that's necessary to revitalize society. It's the principle of consciousness, and it exists eternally insofar as consciousness exists eternally. But it also has to be incarnated, like as a carpenter, in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, in this tiny town, in this obscure place. And the joint idea between those two is that the infinite has to be brought into the finite in order to be realized. And that's what you're trying to do in your life, is to take the archetype and to manifest it in the specific conditions of your life with your restrictions and your abilities and your tragedy. And so in my attempts to make this practical, that's what I'm trying to inform people about, is that it's up to them to accept the tragedy of their own existence and to understand that is a cross to bear in the most realistic sense. It's X that marks the spot, right? The spot is suffering, and suffering's at the center of being. Mm-hmm. And you have to accept that voluntarily and make what you can of it. And that's a heroic venture. And it's also the venture that redeems the world. And I believe that's as true as anything is true. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all your perspective on that, and putting yourself out there to help everybody. I think you're definitely living the hero's life there with everything you're doing. So we appreciate it. Yeah.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm glad it's working, and hopefully I'll be able to continue it. That's my deepest hope. It's been somewhat hard on me over the last year, so I'm a little on the shaky side in recent weeks.
Well, I hope you feel better, and I think if nothing else, if you need a break, there's most people I know are not completely caught up on your work, and so I think you get that book out, and even if you just dropped out what you have now, you could take a break for a year, and
maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Yeah. Well, it was very good talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for your time, Jordan, and I'll see you in Toronto. I'll be there for the talk, and I've got a podcast with Oren that we'll be recording too.
Oh, so, you do, eh? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm very much looking forward to it. I hate getting on planes, but I'm doing it for this one. It's a pilgrimage.
Good. Yep.
All right.
Well, a pilgrimage takes you out of your locale and broadens your horizons, so hopefully that'll be what happens.
Sounds good to me.
All right.
Thank you, Jordan.
All right, so that was our conversation with Jordan Peterson. I really hope that you guys enjoyed that, and I highly encourage you to go and check out his work online. There is a ton of it, and I've just found it to be a great positive influence in my life, and I hope it will be in yours too. So if you have enjoyed this episode of the Datsusara podcast and you want to find out more information about the show, you can go to dspodcast.com. We've got some guests that are kind of related to Peterson in other ways. A clinical psychologist called Clay Rutledge. He will be coming up, as well as Dr. Oren Amate. So I think if you enjoyed this, you will enjoy those shows too, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you'd like to help support the show, please check out my company, which is also called Datsusara. We make all sorts of mostly hemp-based gear and products, everything from bags like duffel bags and backpacks to apparel like hoodies, t-shirts. We also have some hemp protein powder, soap that has some hemp in it. One of the great things about hemp is that it is antimicrobial. The material for bags and apparel is breathable, strong, and of course it's all very sustainable, so that's always nice too. And if you want to check out more about me personally, check out at DatsuChris on Twitter, or track me down on other various social media outlets. Alright, thanks a lot everybody for listening. Be seeing you.
Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way.